Nathaniel Nate Brooks sat in the spacious leather-clad office, the city's skyline reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 52, he was every bit the image of success, a man who had built his empire from the ground up. His face, weathered yet commanding, bore the marks of time, but his steel-blue eyes remained sharp. The firm he had started 15 years ago now stood among the top in the city. His name alone carried weight in corporate circles, evoking awe and envy in equal measure. The office exuded luxury. Mahogany shelves lined with first-edition books, minimalist yet expensive decor, and an abstract painting hanging behind his polished desk. The desk itself was barren, except for a sleek laptop and a photo frame turned face down, covered in a thin layer of dust as if it had been untouched for years. Nate's life was one of material triumph. He had the penthouse in Manhattan, the sleek cars, and the social status. He was a man who had it all, or so it seemed. To the outside world, Nate Brooks had mastered the art of living well. But beneath the surface there was a hollowness that nothing, no deal, no luxurious vacation, no high society party could fill. That hollowness had a name, though he rarely allowed himself to speak it. Family. 15 years ago, Nate walked away. From his wife, from his children, from the life that had once been the anchor to his soul. The memories of that day still lurked in the corners of his mind, haunting him in moments when he was most vulnerable. Late at night, when the silence became deafening, or in brief pauses between meetings when his thoughts caught up to him. It had been a fight, a volcanic eruption of words that spiraled out of control, but that was only the surface. His departure wasn't just because of that argument. It was the culmination of years of quiet suffering, of feeling like he was drowning under the weight of his family's expectations. His wife Elise had been a force of nature, strong-willed, passionate, always pushing him to be more present, more emotionally involved. But he couldn't. He didn't know how. And then there was Evan. The thought of his son sent a stab of pain so intense through his chest that Nate could scarcely breathe. Evan had been 8 years old, sweet, curious, with wide brown eyes that always seemed to seek his father's approval. Nate still remembered the night he held Evan's feverish body, the silent desperation as the doctor's words blurred together. Inoperable, untreatable, fatal. Evan's death had shattered something inside Nate, something beyond repair. Afterward, Elise had turned to Nate, craving comfort, support, but all he could offer was his withdrawal, a silent retreat into his work. The grief had fractured their marriage beyond mending, so one day Nate packed a suitcase and left. Not just the house, but the city, the state, the entire life he had once known. He thought maybe distance would dull the pain, that he could outrun his grief. But grief, he learned, was not something you could escape. It clung to you, like an invisible shadow, always there, even in the quietest moments. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the office door creaking open. Caroline, his assistant, peered in, her professional smile in place. "Mr. Brooks, your car is ready. You have the client dinner in an hour." Nate nodded, barely acknowledging her before she left. He stood, straightened his tailored suit, and glanced briefly at the downturned photograph on his desk. He hadn't looked at it in years, not since he had placed it face down in some futile attempt to shut away the past. His hand hovered above it now, a flicker of impulse urging him to flip it over. But just like countless times before, he turned away, walking out of the office, leaving the ghosts behind. Yet, they always followed him, lingering just out of sight. Nate's car hummed as it wound through the busy streets of Manhattan, but inside, the silence was unbearable. He didn't bother with music. Noise, any noise, would only make the emptiness inside him more pronounced. He had become a master at pretending. Pretending that his success was enough, that the glittering life he had built was a sufficient substitute for the warmth of a family. His relationships were transactional, shallow. No deep conversations. No meaningful connections. He was surrounded by people, yet isolated. The city's bright lights blurred outside the window as the car pulled up to an upscale restaurant. Tonight, he would shake hands with investors, talk numbers, and laugh at jokes he didn't find funny. He would do what he did best, wear the mask of the successful man who had everything under control. But inside, the mask was crumbling. As he stepped out of the car, a small thought, One that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind for years, surfaced with more clarity than ever before. What if I had stayed? The question sat heavy in his chest, a boulder of regret that had grown with each passing year. He had left to escape the pain, but had he only traded one form of suffering for another? Sure, he had wealth and power, but what was it all worth if it only amplified his loneliness? He had built walls around himself, convinced that he didn't need anyone. But the truth was, he did. Nate made his way inside the restaurant, exchanging pleasantries with the maitre, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been 15 years, 15 long years since he had last seen Elise, since he had walked out on his remaining children, leaving them in the wake of their brother's death. He hadn't looked back. Until now. The restaurant was dimly lit, with warm golden hues reflecting off polished wood and crystal chandeliers. Nate sat at the head of the long table, listening to the hum of conversation around him. Investors laughed and exchanged stories, the gentle clinking of silverware and glasses adding to the low buzz of the upscale atmosphere. Yet, he was miles away in his mind, mechanically nodding and smiling, but not truly present. The conversation danced around quarterly reports and market trends, but Nate barely registered any of it. His thoughts, once sharp and focused, kept drifting. He excused himself, needing fresh air, an escape from the suffocating formality of it all. The city was alive tonight, as it always was. Even at this hour, the streets pulsed with energy, people rushing to unknown destinations, taxis honking, the distant hum of life in a place that never truly rested. He stepped onto the sidewalk, rain beginning to mist the air, creating a haze that softened the harsh glow of streetlights. He walked aimlessly, pulling his coat tighter around him. The rain was barely noticeable at first, but soon it became heavier, the cold droplets stinging his skin. He turned into a quieter street, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. It was there, in the corner of his vision, that he noticed her. At first, he thought she was just another part of the urban scenery, a disheveled figure hunched near a bus stop, soaking wet under the relentless rain. But something about the way she sat, arms wrapped around her knees, head bowed, made him pause. She looked fragile, almost childlike, though her features were obscured by the hood of a worn jacket. Nate hesitated, his first instinct to walk past her, to keep going as he always had. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped for strangers. His life had no room for these kinds of interruptions. Especially not now, when he barely had a grip on his own spiraling emotions. But something about her presence tugged at him. He stood there for a moment longer, his mind in conflict. She hadn't noticed him, didn't even seem aware of the world around her. Nate almost turned away, but then he saw it. A glimpse of something in the way she tilted her head, her profile catching in the faint light. A fleeting image that struck him like a lightning bolt. Elise. His wife, or ex-wife now, he supposed. She had often sat like that in the days after Evan's death, curled in on herself, lost in a grief that Nate had never been able to reach. That memory was enough. Against his usual instincts, he took a step forward. "Are you all right?" His voice sounded foreign to him, almost too loud against the quiet patter of rain. The figure flinched, as though startled out of a deep reverie. Slowly, she lifted her head, revealing wide, sunken eyes framed by strands of wet hair. She couldn't have been more than 20, maybe 25 at most, but her face held a weariness far beyond her years. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she blinked, confused by the stranger addressing her. Nate took another step, more cautious now. "Do you need help?" he asked, softer this time. She shook her head quickly, her movements defensive, like someone used to being ignored, or worse, dismissed. "I'm fine," she murmured, though her appearance said otherwise. Her clothes were threadbare, clinging to her small frame in the rain, and her eyes, those hollow, desperate eyes, spoke of someone on the edge. Nate should have left it at that. It was none of his business. This was a city full of people with stories like hers, people who fell through the cracks, lost in the noise and indifference. He wasn't equipped to fix anything for her. He could offer her money, sure, but that felt too transactional, too impersonal. But something kept him rooted to the spot. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked after a moment of silence stretched between them. "A place to stay?" She hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. The brief pause was enough of an answer for Nate. "Come on," he said, before he could second-guess himself. "There's a diner a few blocks over. You should get out of the rain." Again, she looked at him as if trying to gauge whether he was serious or some kind of threat. But exhaustion must have worn her down, because she finally nodded, pushing herself up with trembling hands. They walked in silence. The rain eased as they turned onto a quieter street, the neon glow of the all-night diner up ahead. Nate opened the door for her, and the warmth inside felt like a shock compared to the chill of the streets. They found a booth near the window, the harsh overhead lights making her appear even more gaunt than before. A waitress came by, placing a couple of menus down with a practiced smile. The girl fidgeted, staring at the laminated menu as if she didn't know what to do with it. "Order whatever you want," Nate said, sliding the menu closer to her. Her eyes flicked up to his, still cautious, but now with a hint of confusion, as if she couldn't understand why a stranger would offer her any kind of kindness. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate wasn't sure how to answer. Why was he helping her? He could have kept walking, left her sitting in the rain. It wasn't as if she reminded him of anyone he knew, except maybe Elise, but that wasn't it. Maybe, on some level, he saw something of himself in her. The lostness, the isolation. "Maybe because no one helped me when I needed it," he said, more to himself than to her. She didn't respond, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, as if his words had struck a chord. They sat in silence after that, the tension between them loosening, if only a little. She ordered a sandwich and a coffee, and as they ate, Nate felt something shift inside him. A quiet awakening, the tiniest crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Later, as they parted ways outside the diner, Nate handed her some money, more than enough to get her somewhere safe for the night. She thanked him, her expression unreadable, before disappearing into the rainy night. Nate stood there for a moment, watching her go, the cold seeping back into him. He should have felt good about what he'd done, but instead a strange heaviness settled in his chest. The girl's presence had stirred something deep within him, something he had buried long ago. A memory flashed before him, unbidden. Evan's smile, wide and innocent on a sunny afternoon in the park. Elise's laughter echoing in the background as they played together, the world still whole, still full of possibility. It was a snapshot of a life that felt 1,000 years away, a life that had died the day he walked away. Nate shook his head, trying to dispel the image. He couldn't afford to think about that now. But the memory lingered, like a shadow trailing him as he walked back to his car, and for the first time in years, Nate felt something he thought he'd buried forever, a pang of longing for the life he had left behind. The next morning, Nate woke to the familiar sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the occasional honk of a horn far below, the murmur of life carrying on. He lay in bed for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, the events of the previous night still weighing on him. He wasn't sure why, but that brief encounter with the girl had unsettled him. It wasn't just that she reminded him of Elise in that fleeting moment. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. He pushed the thoughts aside and rolled out of bed, diving into his usual morning routine, exercise, coffee, and then heading into the office. But throughout the day, his mind kept wandering back to her. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but somehow she had forced him to confront a part of himself he had long since buried. Later that week, after a long day of meetings, Nate found himself walking again. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a reddish glow over the streets. His feet carried him back toward the neighborhood where he had encountered the girl, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe he was hoping to find her again, though he wasn't sure what he would say if he did. It was drizzling, just as it had been that night. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his coat, trying to ward off the cold. His footsteps echoed down the mostly deserted street, the soft patter of rain against pavement the only other sound. And then, as if conjured by his thoughts, he saw her. She was standing just a few yards ahead, near a lamppost, her silhouette framed by the dim light. For a moment, Nate thought he was imagining her. The odds of running into her again in a city this size were slim at best. But as he moved closer, there was no mistaking her. She was drenched again, her jacket hanging heavily on her small frame, her hair plastered to her face. Nate's heart gave a strange, uneasy lurch. This was too much of a coincidence. He approached cautiously, unsure of how to begin. Before he could speak, she looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, wide and hollow, held none of the confusion from before. This time, she seemed expectant, as if she had been waiting for him. "You again," she said, her voice flat but not unkind. "I didn't think I'd see you twice." "Neither did I," Nate admitted, glancing around at the deserted street. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged, a non-committal gesture that didn't answer the question. Same as before, I guess. Something about the way she said it unsettled him. She didn't seem as vulnerable now. If anything, there was a quiet confidence to her. Something that hadn't been there the first time they met. "You should get inside," Nate said, feeling awkward under her unblinking stare. "There's another diner not far from here." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering him. "I'm fine," she said, "but thanks." Nate hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He could walk away, leave her there as he had done so many times before with people in his life. But something about this felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was important, though he didn't yet know why. Before he could respond, she spoke again. "You look like someone who's running from something," she said, her voice soft but pointed. Nate blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "What?" She nodded toward him, as if she could see right through the carefully constructed facade he had built over the years. People don't just help strangers in the rain unless they're trying to fix something in themselves. Nate stared at her, the discomfort growing. She was too perceptive, too aware of things she had no right knowing. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his tone more defensive than he intended. "I don't need to," she replied, her voice calm and measured. "I can see it. You've been running for a long time." Nate felt a flare of irritation, but it was quickly smothered by something else. Fear. She wasn't wrong. He had been running for years. But how could she know that? She was a stranger, someone he had met by chance on a rainy night. And yet, the way she looked at him made him feel exposed, as if she knew more about him than he wanted to admit. "You don't understand anything about my life," he said, shaking his head. "I've moved on. I've built something for myself. Moved on?" She interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "From what? A family? A life? You don't look like someone who's moved on, Nate." The sound of his name on her lips was like a punch to the gut. He hadn't told her his name. Nate's heart raced. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice low, tension creeping into his words. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked away, as if weighing her next words carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost apologetic. "You're not the only one who's been running," she said. "I've been running too, in a way." Nate felt a chill crawl up his spine. There was something she wasn't telling him, something important. "Who are you?" he demanded, his pulse quickening. She didn't look at him this time. Instead, she stared down at the ground, her shoulders tense. "I'm someone who knows where you came from, someone who knows the life you left behind." Nate took a step back, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" The girl sighed, a sound that held more weight than someone her age should carry. "It's complicated," she said finally. "But you're not the only one who lost something all those years ago." Nate stared at her, confusion and fear swirling in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. This time she met his gaze, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Nate's stomach twist. "I'm connected to your past," she said quietly. "I know about your family, and I know why you left." Nate's breath caught in his throat. How could she possibly know any of that? His mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the answers evaded him. Before he could ask another question, she turned on her heel and began walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the rainy street. Nate stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched her go. There was a knot of dread tightening in his gut, a feeling that whatever had just happened wasn't over. And for the first time in years, Nate felt afraid of what he might uncover if he dared to look back at the life he had abandoned. Nate couldn't sleep that night. The encounter with the girl, her haunting eyes, the way she had known his name without him ever telling her, gnawed at him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse bedroom, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. How did she know about his past? Who was she? What did she meant when she said she had been running too? Each question felt like a blade twisting in his chest, opening old wounds he had spent years trying to close. He had buried his past deep, but now it was clawing its way back to the surface, forcing him to confront it in a way he never had before. The night dragged on, and as the first light of dawn crept into the room, Nate made a decision. He had to know. For the first time in years, Nate found himself looking back. Not just figuratively, but literally. That morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, he stood in his living room, staring at the old photo album he hadn't touched in over a decade. It had been buried under a pile of old documents, hidden away like the memories it contained. With shaking hands, he opened it. The first few pages were filled with happy moments. Pictures of him and Elise on their wedding day, her radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire frame. Then came the photos of Evan, the tiny baby cradled in his arms, the proud father staring down at him with love and awe. As he turned the pages, the memories became more painful. Evan's illness, the hospital visits, the distant look in Elise's eyes as the weight of their son's condition pulled them apart. Nate's chest tightened as he reached the last page. There was a picture of Evan, taken just a few weeks before he passed. His smile was small but genuine, as if he still believed that everything would be okay, despite the tubes and wires attached to his fragile body. Nate couldn't look anymore. He closed the album and pushed it aside, his throat tight with emotion. The past was a wound that hadn't healed, and now, with that girl's sudden appearance, it felt as raw as ever. The next few days passed in a blur. Nate tried to focus on work, throwing himself into meetings and negotiations, but the weight of what had happened gnawed at him, distracting him at every turn. His mind kept going back to the girl, to her cryptic words. He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, he made a decision. He needed answers. If this girl knew something about his past, he needed to find out what. But where to start? He hadn't spoken to Elise or anyone from that life in 15 years. After he left, he had severed all ties, making sure there was no way for them to reach him. It was supposed to be a clean break, a way to start over without the constant reminder of the life he had failed to save. But there were still places he could go, people he could ask. The next day, Nate found himself standing outside a small cafe in his old neighborhood, the one he had lived in with Elise and the kids. It hadn't changed much in the years since he had left. The same red brick buildings lined the streets, and the cafe still had the same chipped paint around the windows. The familiarity of it all unsettled him. It felt like he was stepping into a life that no longer belonged to him. Nate took a deep breath and walked inside. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the smell of coffee and baked goods. As he made his way to the counter, he spotted an older man sitting by the window, reading a newspaper. His heart skipped a beat when he realized who it was. Henry. Henry had been one of Nate's closest friends back then. He and Elise had been like family to each other, always spending holidays together, always there for each other in times of need. Nate hadn't thought about Henry in years, but now, seeing him here, it was like no time had passed at all. Henry, Nate said, his voice hesitant as he approached. The older man looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion before recognition dawned on his face. Nate? His voice was incredulous, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Nate nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. Yeah, it's me. Henry stood up slowly, his eyes searching Nate's face as if trying to piece together how much time had passed. I never thought I'd see you again, he said, his voice thick with emotion. After you left, we thought you were gone for good. I thought I was too, Nate admitted, sitting down across from him. But something's happened, and I need to know the truth. Henry's expression darkened. The truth? He repeated. About what? Nate hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. I've been seeing someone, a girl. She knows things about my past, about my family, but I don't know who she is. I need to understand. Henry was silent for a moment, his gaze heavy with something Nate couldn't quite read. There's a lot you don't know, he said quietly. Things we didn't tell you. Things Elise didn't tell you. Nate's stomach clenched. What are you talking about? Henry sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. When you left, Elise didn't just let it end there. She tried to find you. For years, she searched for you. But she was also hiding something. Something that would have changed everything. Nate felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? Henry looked at him, his eyes filled with regret. There was someone else. After Evan died, and after you left, Elise found out she was pregnant. She had a daughter, Nate. The world seemed to tilt beneath Nate's feet, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't speak. A daughter? The words came out in a whisper, disbelief thick in his voice. Henry nodded. Her name is Lily. She's grown now, of course, but she's your daughter, Nate, and she's been looking for you. Nate's mind reeled, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a daughter? A child he never knew about? All this time he had thought he had left everything behind, that his past was a closed chapter. But it wasn't. It never had been. Lily, he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. She's been looking for me? Henry nodded again. She's been asking about you for years. I don't know how, but it sounds like she finally found you. Nate sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. The girl, the one from the rain, could she be Lily? His daughter? He had assumed she was just another lost soul. But now everything made sense. The way she had known his name, the way she had looked at him with that mix of curiosity and sadness. Where is she? Nate asked, his voice hoarse. I need to see her. Henry hesitated. I don't know where she is right now, but she's not far. She's been around, trying to track you down. I think she's waiting for you to come to her. Nate's hands trembled as he processed the information. His daughter, the child he never knew existed. All these years she had been searching for him, and he had been too blind, too wrapped up in his own grief, to realize it. Suddenly, the weight of his choices, the years of running and hiding, felt unbearable. He had thought he could leave his past behind, but it had caught up to him in the form of a daughter he had never known. And now he had a chance to finally face the truth, to stop running. I need to find her, Nate said, standing up abruptly. I need to fix this. Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. You do, Nate. It's time. Nate couldn't shake the feeling of urgency that pulsed through his veins as he left the cafe. The revelation of Lily's existence had hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away years of carefully constructed detachment. The truth, so simple yet monumental, was now unignorable. He had a daughter, and she had been out there, searching for him all this time. For years, Nate had believed he was protecting himself by staying away, by building a life where the past couldn't reach him. But now, the emptiness inside him had a name. It wasn't just the grief over Evan, or the guilt about abandoning Elise. It was the absence of the life he should have been living, the relationships he should have been nurturing. And chief among those was the relationship with Lily. He hailed a cab, his thoughts swirling in a haze of guilt, hope, and fear. He didn't know where she was, but there was one place he had to go first, a place he had avoided for 15 years. The cemetery. It was late afternoon by the time Nate arrived at the cemetery gates, the sky painted in muted shades of gray. He hesitated at the entrance, his breath catching in his throat. The place hadn't changed much, though it felt smaller now, more confined. His footsteps echoed against the stone pathway as he made his way to Evan's grave, the knot in his chest tightening with every step. When he reached the small gravestone, he froze. His heart ached as he read the inscription, the familiar words that he had once memorized, but which now felt foreign and raw. Evan Brooks, 2010, beloved son, always in our hearts. The pain of losing Evan was still there, as sharp and unbearable as it had been the day they buried him. But now, that grief was tangled with something else, a deeper sorrow for the daughter he had never known and the years he had missed. The years he could never get back. He knelt down by the grave, his hand trembling as he traced the engraved letters with his fingertips. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Evan. For a long moment, the world around him was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the years he had lost wash over him. And then, in the quiet, a soft voice broke the stillness. I come here sometimes too, you know? Nate's eyes snapped open, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw her standing just a few feet away. It was the girl from the rain, the girl he now knew was Lily, his daughter. She looked different in the daylight, though her expression still held that quiet intensity that had unsettled him before. Her eyes, so much like Elise's, were filled with a mixture of sadness and uncertainty. She took a tentative step toward him, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket. Nate's throat went dry. He stood slowly, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of which could form into coherent words. "Lily," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Saying her name aloud felt like crossing an invisible line, as though acknowledging her made everything real. She nodded, her gaze never leaving his. "I figured you'd come here eventually," she said quietly. "I've been waiting." Nate's heart twisted painfully at her words. Waiting. She had been waiting for him, and he had spent all these years running. The enormity of it hit him like a punch to the gut. "I didn't know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know about you. If I had." Lily's expression softened, but there was still a guardedness to her, a wall built by years of absence and unanswered questions. "I know you didn't," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "but that doesn't change the fact that you weren't there." Her words cut deep, but Nate knew she was right. He hadn't been there. And no amount of explaining or apologizing could undo the damage his absence had caused. "I'm sorry?" he said, his voice trembling with the weight of the apology he had been carrying for years. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I should have been there. For you. For your mother." Lily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the enormity of the lost years hanging between them like a thick fog. And then, with a shaky breath, she spoke. "I don't need you to fix everything," she said softly. "I don't even know if we can fix it, but I needed to meet you. I needed to understand why you left." Nate swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. How could he explain? How could he possibly make her understand the fear, the grief, the overwhelming sense of failure that had driven him away? "I left because I was broken," he said finally, his voice raw. "When Evan died, I didn't know how to handle it. I couldn't be what your mother needed me to be, and I couldn't be what you would have needed me to be. So I ran. I ran because I thought it would be easier. But it wasn't. Not for me, and certainly not for you." Lily's eyes flickered with emotion, and she nodded slowly, as if trying to process his words. "I used to wonder what you were like," she admitted. "Mom never talked about you much after you left. She tried to pretend you didn't exist, but I always wondered." Nate's heart ached at her words. He had left her with nothing but questions, with an empty space where a father should have been. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't even know if I deserve to be part of your life now. But I want to try, if you'll let me." Lily was silent for a moment, her eyes studying him as if she were trying to decide whether he was worth the risk. Finally, she let out a soft sigh, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I don't know what this is supposed to look like," she said honestly. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter, but I'm willing to try too. I think that's what Mom would have wanted." At the mention of Elise, Nate's heart clenched painfully. He had left her too, and now it was too late to make amends with her. But maybe, just maybe, he could make things right with Lily. They stood there, side by side in the quiet cemetery, the weight of their shared past heavy but not insurmountable. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There was still so much to say, so much to unpack. But it was a beginning. "I don't know how to do this either," Nate admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Lily nodded, a small tentative smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As they left the cemetery together, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the gravestones. Nate looked over at Lily, his daughter, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could build something new. Something that mattered. Weeks passed, and though the weight of the past still lingered between them, Nate and Lily began to carve out a new path together. The first few days after their reconciliation were tentative, filled with awkward silences, long pauses, and moments where both seemed unsure of what to say. But slowly, little by little, they started to talk. Lily told him about her life, about growing up without a father, about how her mother had struggled to raise her on her own. Elise had been strong, Lily said, but she had also been hurt. The absence of Nate had hung over their household like a shadow, one that Lily couldn't quite understand until she was old enough to piece together the fragments of their family's broken history. Nate listened, his heart aching with guilt as Lily shared the stories of her childhood. Birthday parties where her friends had fathers, but hers never showed. Or how she would make up stories in her head about where he was and what he was doing, imagining him as a hero on some grand adventure. In reality, he had been hiding, locked away in a life of luxury and isolation, afraid to face the pain he had left behind. It wasn't easy to hear, but Nate knew he had to. It was part of the price he had to pay for the years he had missed. And yet, despite the painful memories, there was something else in Lily's voice, something Nate hadn't expected. A quiet resilience, a strength born from the struggles she had endured. They began to meet regularly, at first for coffee or lunch, slowly easing into each other's lives. At times, it felt surreal to Nate, sitting across from this young woman who was so clearly his daughter, and yet a stranger in many ways. She had Elise's fiery determination, but she also had Nate's quiet introspection. The same thoughtful pauses before she spoke, the same habit of looking away when her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. As the weeks turned into months, Nate found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't opened up to anyone in years. He told her about the guilt he had carried, about how Evan's death had broken something inside him that he hadn't known how to fix. He told her about his life after he left, the hollow success he had built for himself, and how none of it had mattered because it couldn't fill the emptiness in his heart. Lily listened, sometimes with a quiet intensity, sometimes with tears in her eyes, but she never judged him. She had every right to be angry, every right to shut him out, but instead, she had chosen to give him a chance. And for that, Nate was grateful beyond words. One day they met at a park not far from the neighborhood where Nate had lived with Elise and Evan all those years ago. The air was crisp, the leaves a golden hue as autumn settled over the city. They walked in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of an understanding that didn't need words. As they sat on a bench overlooking the small lake, Lily turned to him with a question that had been lingering between them for weeks. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why did you come back after all this time?" Nate exhaled slowly, gazing out at the water. It was a question he had asked himself many times since the day he first saw her sitting in the rain. Why had he stopped that night? Why had he decided to help her, a stranger, when for years he had turned away from the pain of others, especially those he loved? "I don't know," he said honestly. "For years I've been running from everything, from you, from Mom, from my past. I thought if I built a life without all the pain, maybe I could forget it. But that's not how it works, is it?" Lily shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, it's not. I think deep down I knew something was missing," Nate continued, "but I was too afraid to face it. And then, when I saw you that night, it was like everything I had been running from finally caught up to me. I couldn't keep pretending anymore." Lily was quiet for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I'm glad you did," she said softly. "I've spent most of my life wondering what it would be like to meet you. I wasn't sure if I ever would." Nate's chest tightened. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been. I should have stayed." Lily nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Yeah, you should have," she agreed. But then after a pause she added, "But you're here now, and that's what matters." Nate looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and love for this daughter he was only just beginning to know. She had every right to hate him, every right to turn away, but instead she had chosen to give him a second chance. It was more than he deserved, but he would take it. He would do whatever it took to make things right. A few weeks later, Nate stood outside a small suburban house, his hand trembling slightly as he knocked on the door. He had come full circle, returning to the house he had once called home, the house where he had built a life with Elise and their children, only to abandon it when the weight of grief became too much. The door opened, and an older woman smiled at him warmly. She was Elise's sister, Kate, and she had been the one to raise Lily after Elise's death a few years earlier. Nate hadn't seen her in years, But she welcomed him inside with the kind of grace that made him feel both guilty and grateful. Inside, the house felt familiar yet different. The furniture had changed, the walls were painted, but there was a warmth here. A sense of family that Nate had been missing for so long. As he stepped into the living room, his breath caught in his throat. Lily stood by the fireplace, smiling softly, and beside her was a small boy, no more than 6 years old, his bright eyes filled with curiosity as he looked up at Nate. "This is Max," Lily said, her voice filled with pride. "My son." Nate's heart swelled as he knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. Max stared at him for a moment, then broke into a shy smile. "Are you Grandpa?" he asked, his voice innocent and sweet. Nate's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess I am." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, Nate felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He had lost so much, but somehow, in the most unexpected way, he had been given a second chance. A chance to be part of something again, to build a new life filled with love and connection. As he held Max's small hand in his, Nate looked over at Lily, who smiled at him with a mixture of gratitude and hope. And for the first time in years, Nate allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future where he wasn't running anymore. The past would always be there, but now, so was something else, something that made all the difference, a new beginning.